Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Eugene Ashton from Jonathan Ball Publishers, and it's a delight for me this evening to invite you to the launch of the ANC Billionaires. And wonderful to have Pieter du Toit here, who's no stranger to these events. These days we think of him more an author than a journalist, although his day job and employers probably disagree. It's a pleasure tonight to also have with us Mpumelelo Mkhabela, former editor of the Daily Dispatch and the Sowetan, of course a columnist now for News 24, in his own right a political analyst and a bit of an expert on mining, I'm told, which leads into a lot of tonight's conversation. This book, the genesis of this book goes back about 2 years, and like many of our books, of the books that Pieter's done, was born at the Troyville Hotel over a bit of chicken. And Pieter, being a sport for these things, I said to him, look, the important thing is to get your wife on side. Don't worry about anybody else. I'll worry about your boss, you worry about your wife, who's the real boss. And fortunately, she agreed. So here we are, 2 years later, launching this absolutely magnificent work. And it really is a magnificent book. And look forward tonight to hearing what you have to say. Welcome. Thank you.
Good evening. Welcome, everybody. I like the fact that Eugene was promoting my book. I thought he was promoting Peter's book. I love that. Thank you. Well, guys, today's discussion is about the transition. The transition from apartheid to democracy and all the intricacies that went with that. And there's been so much written and so much speculation and so much theorizing and so much pontification about what the transition meant. The predominant story is that it was a marital transition because we averted civil war. Some people call it was a sellout transition. Black people were sold out. Some people talk about it was a fake transition. We're still under apartheid. Some people talk about all kinds of things. And today we are lucky enough that we have got Pieter du Toit, who has taken an initiative to give us some insights about that transition that people have speculated on, people have struggled to classify, describe, people have struggled to make sense of it. And I'm glad today to be in conversation with Pieter about a subject which I know we both like. We don't always agree, we disagree, we agree on some few issues, and we debate others, and we leave others undecided. But that's a South African type of debate. Pieter, welcome, and this is your show. I'll give you as much time as possible to explore and discuss with me. Thanks. And share with the audience the rationale for the book and why we have the book.
Yeah.
And I'm sure towards the end, we'll also discuss contemporary politics.
Absolutely.
And we'll open up to the audience to ask some questions in case I didn't ask what they're interested to know about the writing of this book.
And Mpumi, I just want to say thank you everyone for coming out. It's a Wednesday or Tuesday evening rather, and it's difficult. So thanks for everyone for being here, and for Mpumi doing it as well. Mpumi and I have known each other since our days in Parliament when Thabo Mbeki was still president, which was a long time ago. And I couldn't think of anyone better to have a conversation tonight with. So thank you, Mpumi.
Thank you, Pieter. Let's kick off very quickly without wasting time. The first question that is normal when you have published a book, especially on something that's very topical with a very sensational title, as we have today, the ANC Billionaires, and is what triggered the idea of this book?
Mpumi, first of all, I think we're in a country where our history remains contested, and where our the present day is a difficult country to live in. We're in a difficult space and in a difficult environment. And the book was really born after I wrote The Stellenbosch Mafia, which in the heady days of RET and Bell Pottinger became such a swear word, the swear phrase rather, the Stellenbosch Mafia. And part of the book was the rise of Afrikaner capital as a project of the nationalist government, which was a political project, and out of that was born the same kind of investigation, I think, into what made the new post-1994 wealthy billionaire class. That's all of them are linked to the ANC. What was the source of that? And the relationship and similarities between the rise of Afrikaner capitalism and African nationalist capitalism is quite uncanny. You know, both were part of a bigger political project, and both were born out of a fraught immediate history. For the Afrikaner capitalists of the 1930s and 40s, it was the aftermath of the Anglo-Boer War, and for the African nationalist capitalists, it was the aftermath of apartheid. And all of those wealthy individuals were put forward as part of some or other political project. And it fascinated me, and that part of history fascinated me because, you know, the transition remains contested terrain, I think. They created this very well-to-do white middle class. Obviously, the context is different. Under apartheid and Afrikaner capitalists, you know, they were advantaged by a system which gave them a massive leg up in life. Whereas, you know, post '94, the environment is much different. But the interest in our economic system, in reasons why the economic structure has not really changed since 1994. I think now, whilst we're all battling with load shedding in Johannesburg, with water shedding, with a tepid economy, with poor political leadership, you know, people want to understand why we are here. You know, and this is not the definitive story, but it's definitely a part of the story, I think.
We're going to explore a little bit of that connection with the contemporary politics and how that is actually emanating from the past and how the transition was crafted. But let me go back to the issue of the book. So you were triggered to write the book because you were fascinated by the history and because some of the current issues can be explained by tracking back to where we come from. Yeah. But how did you decide on the format? Because, I mean, I think I once mentioned to you that there's so many people who have written about this transition. Yeah. I mean, among them, Sam Peter Blanche. Many others have written, Esther Yeser, the philosopher at Stellenbosch, he wrote a book about it. And many other people have written books about the transition, exploring their own understanding of what happened. And you decided not to go the academic route. There isn't much literary reference in your book. You decided to get to individuals who are still alive, who were part of crafting that transition. And you brought them together in what appears to me a very conversational book. How did you decide on that?
So, Mpumi, you're right. I did not want to tell a story that has been told before. And the economic transition is a phase or a part of the transition that I don't think has been told to the same extent that the political transition has been told in recent past. Obviously, you know, you want to build a story around individuals, around characters like Cyril Ramaphosa or a Patrice Motsepe or a Saki Makuzoma. But in order to understand how they became as wealthy as they did, you had to understand where that came from. And it came from, I argue in the book, a visit in 1985 that Anglo-Americans leadership, they visited the ANC in exile in Lusaka in Zambia. Because 1985 was an enormously disruptive year in this country. It was the year in which P.W. Botha, who was then the apartheid president, gave that famous Rubicon speech, which turned out not to be crossing the Rubicon. It was the year in which the state of emergency almost became permanent. The ANC announced that they want to make the country ungovernable, which to a large extent they were able to do. COSATU was established. Banks overseas recalled South African loans, and the country really became a pariah state. So 85 was a turning point. And Anglo-Americans leadership, which I found fascinating, decided to try and engage the ANC because it was clear that P.W. Botha's government was not going to do it. Mandela was still in prison. There was no inkling that he was going to be released. And business decided that they had to look after their own interests. If they were going to continue making these super profits in the country, they had to try and negotiate some or other truce in order to be able to maintain what they were able to extract from the country. So I tried to tell that story, which I think hasn't been told in this way before. And also I wanted to bring in voices who were still alive, because Mpumi, you and I very well know that many of the people that were involved in that transition, in negotiating that, are getting old, are dying. And I really feel strongly about the fact that these stories need to be written down. You know, there are still, the book could have been twice as long as it is, you know, if the publisher gave me more time. But
It would have been unreadable.
Well, you need to make it readable, like you say. I mean, you had to, you know, I'm a journalist, I'm not an academic, so it needs to be readable, needs to be accessible, but it needs to be as accurate as possible. So you know, I tried to start with the history from 85 and bring it to present day.
Now, you and I are typical political reporters or political journalists. And then you took on a subject which is got to do with the economic history. And there's something about that connection, in a sense that it seems to me the book is like busting the myth that business is just for business. It comes across here very clearly that business is actually a political actor.
Business is a political actor. You know, during the TRC, there was a session, or there was a special hearing around the role of business during apartheid. And some of the big companies did go and testify. The Ruperts went there with Rembrandt. Barlow World was there. Naspers, Nationale Pers, Naspers was not there. They refused to go and testify in front of the TRC.
But the CEO of Media 24 apologized for apartheid a few years ago.
Yes, Esmery Weideman did, and there were, I think, 40 journalists who made individual submissions, but the company itself did not. So business has always had an ambivalent political role. You know, it's always been afraid to stick its neck out, and even during those times, 80 to 1994, there was a reluctance. But I think, and that's not something that the RET crowd wants to hear, but I think there was more of a commitment to try and bring about change from business then than there is now. And I found it fascinating that there were individuals. Obviously, a company like Anglo American wanted to look after its own interests. And interviewing Michael Spicer, who was a former senior executive at Anglo, who died earlier this year, unfortunately, he explained to me that business felt that it had to protect its own interests, and they thought of it as a kind of a benevolent self-interest. They wanted to protect their own interests, but they also saw the bigger picture. So it was complicated, and our history is complicated and complex. Yeah. And I think it's not black and white. Our history rather is shades of grey. So that was fascinating to me. And I think there's a lot of things in the book which people will not agree with. But this is the story of the individuals who were there and who were in the room, and who tried to make difficult decisions in a very short period of time with very limited options available to them.
Yeah, and it seems as if there was a lot of tension at different levels. There was a tension between the apartheid government and business. And business was not a monolithic or hegemonic type group. It was divided in different. There was typical English traditional business. There was Afrikaans business. Yeah. And then there was an emerging black business groupings. Yeah. They all had different interests. Yeah. They were not pursuing the same thing. But eventually they came together into something about the transition.
You're right. I mean, business is not monolithic. It's not a big hegemonic organism that people often think it is. So Anglo-American was different from Barlow World, was much different from Rembrandt. When Anglo flew to Lusaka, when Gavin Reilly was the executive chairperson of Anglo-American, decided to take matters into his own hands, to fuel up the Anglo jet and fly from the then Jan Smuts Airport to Lusaka, where he engaged with Kenneth Kahunda, who helped arrange this meeting. He extended an invitation to Rembrandt and to Anton Rupert and Johan Rupert, I think, to attend this meeting, and they did not want to. In fact, Harry Oppenheimer didn't want Anglo's people to go. So within these companies, there were different approaches and different ideologies. Clem Santa told me that, yes, they were, on the Anglo executive back then, they were enlightened people who thought that business should use the leverage that they had with the government of the day to better effect. And then there were other executives on Anglo's management who felt that, no, you can't negotiate with terrorists, which was parroting the line by P.W. Botha and many in the National Party government. So there were many layers of ideology and approaches and differing theories about how to move the country forward. So it was interesting, even 30, almost 40 years after the fact, that many people were willing to talk about it openly, and many weren't, even though, that part of history is now come and gone.
Yeah, I would actually, the Rupert are quite interesting family, in a sense that during P.W. Bora's time, Anton Rupert had several clashes with Anton Rupert, the patriarch of the Rupert Empire, and Verwoerd as well. Yeah. But at the same time, they were affiliated to the Broederbond. And at the same time, there was a time when they wanted to actually partner with black businesses in the town, in the homelands, where Anton Rupert was talking about going 50-50 with black people, which I think was the original thinking around partnerships between blacks and whites. It's not a subject that you go through, but I'm just saying it's interesting that they took the posture they took. And the old Rupert often talked about like economic emancipation is more important than political emancipation, because you rather trade with somebody who has money to buy something than to actually try to trade with someone who's poor. Yeah. So you have to have transactions happening with people who have got something together. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, whether for you the distinction between the Afrikaans capitalist, which was in the case of the Ruperts, vis-a-vis the English capital, which was the Anglo-Americans, whether you found any discerning differences there between the two in terms of how they approach the transition.
Absolutely. It's politics and economics, as you very well know when we're in Parliament, you can't write about politics if you don't have a basic working understanding of the economy. And we found that out, you and I, in 2007, 8, 9, when things changed dramatically after Polokwane, and where we could see political decisions having lasting and significant effects on the economy. And similarly, during apartheid and post-apartheid, politics and economics go hand in hand. The economic ruling class need the political ruling class to work with them, and the political ruling class needs the economic ruling class to play ball as well. They're dependent on each other. If the economic ruling class wants to remain in power and wants to remain in the very favorable financial position that they're in, they need a stable political environment. Similarly, if politicians want to stay in power, they need a stable and an active and an economic environment that delivers returns. So they are independent or dependent on each other, rather, which means there's a seriously grey area where politics and economics intersect, and that was the same way during apartheid, and it's exactly the same way post-apartheid. The economic ruling class, they don't move in lockstep with the politicians, but they try to remain as close as they can. So the economic ruling class are not inclined to challenge the political status quo. Yeah. If they do so, it's very late in the day. And what happened, at the end of apartheid, the Anglos and the Barlow world, Anglo-Val, Rembrandt, Liberty, at one stage, those companies, those conglomerates controlled 86% of the JSE, which is almost the whole of the economy. And they saw that things are going south very quickly, and they have to intervene if they want to remain profitable. If they want to be able to operate in the country, they have to start interfering in the political process. And the way they saw they should do it was by influencing the ANC, because I think better than the politicians could, they saw what was coming down the road. They could see what was coming across the horizon. And I think it was self-interest, but I also think individuals like Spicer and others thought that they need to use their leverage to change the country for the better. And that's probably not what people want to hear, but that's what I think happened.
Peter, given your understanding of the dynamics between business or the economy and politics, I must applaud you for having avoided in the book making judgments, because I can tell you now that's what I would have done. Having analyzed all of these interviews and gathered all this material, I could have come to some judgment, and you avoid making a judgment. However, what becomes very clear is that there was an element of co-option in that ideological contestation. Absolutely. Business was seeking to secure its future by making sure the ANC shies away from the old communist socialist thinking, and the ANC also wanted to fast track the transition so that people can come back from exile, they can drop the arms struggle and go for a one man, one vote, and in a free democratic society, non-racial, non-sexist. So they were in a rush for that. But there was this economic gap. There was this mistrust. Can we trust these guys that if we force the government to go for a transition, they won't be communist and nationalize businesses? So there was that kind of serious ideological contest.
Yes, and that's where you, in your introduction, that's where many people argue there was a sellout. You know, was the economy sold out? Was the liberation struggle sold out post-1994? I really enjoyed interviewing Jay Naidu, the firebrand former General Secretary of COSATU, the first General Secretary of COSATU, and he explained to me that they were the mass democratic movement inside of the country was enormously frustrated with the ANC in exile because the MDM in the country, you know, to a large extent represented by the United Democratic Front and COSATU when they were established in 1985, wanted to start talking about a future shape of the South African economy. They wanted to talk about redistribution. Is it growth through redistribution or redistribution through growth? They wanted to have those conversations. And the ANC, on one level, refused to have those conversations because the argument was that type of policies will only be formulated once the ANC is in power. And on another level, according to Manuel and Trevor Manuel, who I interviewed as well, and Jay Naidu, they were just simply ill-prepared to have those conversations. They weren't skilled, and they did not have the ability or the insight or the knowledge to have those conversations, whilst COSATU and the MDM, you know, were starting to debate these issues with academics and, you know, the broader struggle movement inside of the country. So the ANC seemingly refused to have those debates whilst in exile. And that's the gap that big business took. You know, Anglo saw there's a massive disjuncture between the MDM and the ANC in exile, and they started organizing workshops. They established an organization called the Consultative Business Movement, headed up by Tiens Elof, who was later, alongside Pravin Gordhan, in charge of the secretariat at CODESA. And they started arranging meetings between the MDM and businesses and business groupings and executives. And so that process of, I don't want to say indoctrination, but of explaining to the liberation movement that, look, guys, this is the environment that you are coming into. And it was an apartheid capitalist system. So it was within the confines of apartheid, it was seen as a capitalist system, but obviously constrained by the apartheid political system. And then, Mpumi, you had the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. You had the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which discredited the whole socialist and communist experiment. So it was difficult for the ANC when they came back to immediately put in place or put forward some or other economic structure or plan.
Anglo, Michael Spicer and others, they claimed that they had to engage the ANC for the sake of what they called enlightened interest.
Yes.
What were these enlightened interests? Were they really enlightened interests? Or were they just narrow-minded interests to secure profits?
Again, such a complicated question, and depending on who you speak to, you're going to get a different answer. And I tried to speak to the individuals, like I say, who were in the room during those discussions 30 years ago, 40 years ago. I do think that obviously these companies, so they refer to enlightened interest as a combination of looking after your own interest, self-interest, but enlightened in the sense that they wanted the country to change for the better. They wanted human rights for all and one man, one vote, etc., etc. That's what the argument is. And I do think that individuals like Spicer had the interests of the country at heart whilst working for Anglo. Anglo, with Harry Oppenheimer at the helm, you know, was not... It's complicated. You know, they weren't close to the apartheid government during the days of Verwoerd and Vorster and Botha. I mean, Botha despised capital and despised English capital, and Harry Oppenheimer was a swear word in the halls of the National Party. And Oppenheimer with Rupert, you know, they, in their own limited and stunted ways, they did try to alleviate the impact of apartheid through organizations like the Urban Foundation, the Small Business Development Corporation. You know, we can now, with the privilege of hindsight, argue, was that enough? Did they push the apartheid government enough? And obviously not. You know, they could have done a lot more to enforce change much quickly. And I think the intervention of big capital was obviously prompted by difficult business environment. Apartheid became expensive. It became expensive to manage. It became expensive to operate. You know, if you could put it crudely like that, it impacted on businesses' ability to make profit. And that's the capitalist system. And earlier you said that, you know, they are political actors. Yes, they are. But also the job of a business, of an enterprise, is to provide employment, but first and foremost to create returns and profit. And yes, you know, the declining profits, the difficult business environment did prompt them to start moving. But within that movement, I do think there were honest people who had the best interests of the country at heart, like a Michael Spicer.
But I mean, don't you think, Peter, that the fact that as the ANC and business were talking, and then developed all these kinds of back channels, you know, obviously cheating the apartheid system. I mean, there's one incident you describe of somebody who, in a meeting, said, "Listen, this meeting is illegal, so I'm banned by the apartheid government from addressing a crowd. So as we seated here, I'm gonna pretend as if I'm talking to one person. If the rest of you are listening, then you commit the crime."
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that you had that engagement, and which eventually led to the BEE scenario, where a selected few ANC luminaries became very rich, that transition, I mean, surely, Peter, you don't make the judgment, but surely that comes across as a bribe or as some kind of co-option, as some kind of being bought over by capital so that you can jettison your communist narrative. Look, and then when you come to government, you are with us.
Absolutely. Look, Spicer explained to me that when the Anglo delegation flew back from Lusaka, and they flew back in their Anglo G5 Gulfstream jet from Lusaka to Johannesburg, really said to his colleagues that he's concerned that the ANC is still marinated in economic ideas from the 1950s. And as the leader of the preeminent capitalist organization of the country, you know, he needs to start interfering and intervening in that. And they also admitted that Anglo expended enormous resources to influence the transition process, to lobby politicians. You know, and he said, you know, a lot of help, financial and otherwise, were given to returning exiles, including Nelson Mandela. I mean, the Houghton House, you know, he had nothing, you know, but the argument went that they were the incoming political ruling class, and you had to give them a stake in the economy.
But Peter, why do you dedicate one sentence? I promise you, Peter dedicated one sentence
to Mandela.
No, on the father of RET, that he also got a flat from big capital. I mean, this is the guy who would never, according to the rhetoric of the moment, would never accept anything from white capitalists. But there's one paragraph where you refer to him together with Mbeki having been given flats.
Oh, JZ.
Yes.
Look, they were all given housing. They were all given access to Thabo Mbeki for months stayed in Anglo-Americans' executive suites at the Carlton Centre until he was told, look, you can't live off Anglo forever. You have to move out of there. And then he was given a penthouse flat in Hillbrow by Jürgen Kogel, who was working with Van Zyl Slubber to connect business and the ANC. It was a very murky period, Mpumi, and yes, I think a lot of them were co-opted because a lot of the exiles came back with nothing. You know, they were in exile for 30 years. They didn't have pensions. They didn't have money. They didn't have a Volkskas savings account. You know, they didn't know where dentists were, and help was given by big business. And yes, obviously it was to influence them. Obviously it was to get them on side. The bigger argument also was that they had to create a black middle class very quickly, because business felt that if there was no black middle class with an interest in the economy, this transition will not work. And out of that, the empowerment deals came. Out of that, individuals were identified and were given large chunks of big conglomerates to make them part of the economic ruling class. And all of these decisions, as stunted as they were taken in a very short period of time with very limited options. So lots of mistakes were made, I think. lots of people were co-opted. And look, we're sitting in a country where you and I very well know that you've got large corrupt networks of extraction, of patronage, and a lot of that I think can be traced to what happened in the mid 1990s.
Yeah. So, I mean, Peter, would you say that the trust that the business players were trying to cultivate with the ANC leaders has held up? Or would you say that trust got broken somehow?
Trevor Manuel says that trust was broken to a large extent. It was broken during the years of state capture. It was broken with the appointment of people like Malusi Gigaba to Treasury. It was broken by ill-advised economic policies. It was broken by the Polokwane moment where the Mbekiites were thrown out. And a lot of things that have happened over the last 15 years has broken trust between not only business and government, but many sectors and government, civil society, the media and government, business and government, religious groupings in government. So trust has been broken, but business has, over the last 20, they've done exceedingly well still. The mining houses still do very well despite difficult trading conditions and an unpredictable political environment. But I think trust has been broken. I think before 1994 there was an understanding between business and the ANC. After 1994, you had the big business working groups with Nelson Mandela, which largely fell away under Thabo Mbeki, and business did feel sidelined from economic policy decision making. We quickly spoke earlier about the many clashes that Thabo Mbeki had.
But hang on, Peter. But
business.
business loved the gear policy.
They did.
Of Mbeki, and they also actually loved the NDP, which was passed under Zuma in 2011.
They did, and gear was, something that I did not realize, and maybe you knew about this, but between 1994 and 96, when gear was adopted, there was no explicitly stated macroeconomic policy for the country. It was based on the RDP, which according to many critics, largely came down to a wish list of spending, pushed by the left. So gear was welcome, and gear was our own structural adjustment program. Trevor Manuel tells the story of going to Washington before 1994, meeting with the World Bank, meeting with the IMF, and being told that these are the rules that the international system is governed by. If you don't play by it, you might be found wanting. And they returned with Thabo Mbeki and told each other, we do not want to run our country at the behest of the Bretton Woods institutions. We want to run it on our own terms, which meant that they had to follow a quite conservative macroeconomic model. And business did like that because it meant responsible spending, bringing down the budget deficit, the whole argument around trickle-down economics, which was still a major factor at Polokwane. I mean, gear was the biggest single bone of contention in 2007 and remains the biggest fissure that we've seen since 1994 and remains an issue today.
Yeah, I wonder whether it isn't time to open up the platform a bit so it doesn't become a dialogue. We have, can we get the mic to the floor?
Peter and Mpumi.
Maybe you can also share your name if you don't mind from now on.
I'll give you the last name, Nkosi.
Nkosi, okay.
That's right. I would like to get your view on what was called the Macroeconomic Research Group, because MERG, that was led by Vela Pillay, contested the area of macroeconomic policy with Gear. Can you tell me what you know about it?
Very interesting, because actually Peter reflects on that. Peter, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, let me start with that. Look, MERG was, the MERG, let me start off here. MERG has caused it still causes lots of tension inside of the economically minded ANC inner circles. I mean, MERG was driven by Vela Pillay, as you rightly say. He was part of a group of leftist economists who were based in London before 1994. And MERG was very much the left's answer to what the South African economic structure should look like post-1994. And they were sidelined by the Department of Economic Planning, led by Trevor Manuel and individuals like Tito Mboweni and others, in the run-up to 1994. And a lot of that, I think, Mpumi, happened after their visits to Washington, the IMF and World Bank, which was pushed by Nelson Mandela. I mean, Mandela, after his visit to Davos in 1992, where the Chinese and the Vietnamese told him that, look, we are moving away from nationalization. The Merg people were the dominant figures in ANC economic thinking back then. But when the Merg report was finished, and it was presented at the Rosebank Hotel, I think in 1993 it was quickly blown out of the water by Manuel and specifically Thabo Mbeki. And what's interesting about the interviews that I did, every individual that I spoke to identified Thabo Mbeki as an absolute central and critical figure in determining the structure of the economy, or at least the relationship between business and the economy, and also starting to think about a macroeconomic structure. So Merg, still to this day, has caused, it still causes a lot of tension, especially with people around Manuel and Kusatu. So it's still being spoken about. And I write about that extensively in the book. The other question was about Anglo paying.
Very brief. Where Anglo paid everyone.
Look, a lot of money changed hands, and a lot of help was given to individuals and to the ANC. I mean, the ANC's first headquarters, Shell House, which is not the present Luthuli House, used to belong to Munich Reinsurance. The ANC's Department of Economic Planning was housed by Southern Life in a different building. So big business really, I think, before the politicians saw that change was coming, saw that the ANC was going to become the ruling political class, and that they had to give them help to help them back on their feet. I mean, I was also, I forget who it was, but when the ANC was banned in 1960, the apartheid government seized all the assets that the ANC had, as paltry as it was, money, property, and everything else. So when the ANC came back, they literally had nothing except donor money from Swedish countries. Yeah. So I think we forget the context of those times, and I think it's a big problem and a big frustration for me that often we forget the context of the transition and the limited options that were available, and the constraints of the economy and of the political environment.
Don't worry, Peter. We have alleviated that frustration through your book. Is there more questions? My sister there at the back.
Hello. My question is pretty simple. Where do we draw the line between corruption and lobbying? Because what you're describing sounds a lot like lobbying, and in a different context, it's called corruption, right?
Yeah.
So when do the lines become murky?
Yeah.
And is it dependent on what exactly?
I think put
Good
differently,
question.
what kind of principles would have guided the transition at the time without it being regarded as corrupt?
Yeah, let's answer that. Let's discuss that quickly. Look, very good question. You know, buying Mandela House in Houghton, big business, is that bribing? Is that corruption? There's a strong argument that it is corruption, or that it is at least bribery. What did those companies get for their? What did they get from those investments in giving support to returning exiles? But it was a different time, and I think it was difficult for the ANC. They did not have the tools to negotiate this very murky intersection between business and politics, I think. And for business, you know, they saw that the ANC was coming back from exile. They saw that, you know, all things being equal, the ANC were going to become the government. And you could not have a president without a pension fund, or without a Volkskas savings account, or without a car. So help was given. In today's day and age, it would probably come down to buying people off. But in those days, you know, the future of the country depended on, I think, the ANC being not isolated, but giving the means to sustain themselves. Because if they weren't given help by business and others to sustain themselves and survive, I think the possibility for bribery and buying people off would have been much bigger. in the book, I write about the ANC deciding in 1991, I think, to allow a stipend of 2,000 rands each per person per month for returning exiles. Now, that was almost nothing to live on. And a lot of businesses took the gap there and did try and buy off many people. And I think a lot of the corruption that we see today can perhaps be drawn back to those very first couple of years. But it's a very difficult question. It's difficult to answer. But a lot of help was given, but it was given in the context of a country that had to find a way of stabilizing the new incoming political class.
I think one
It's
of the
not satisfactory, I think, but yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things you might find interesting is the chapter where Peter refers to the collapse of the Viva Fund. Business once established what they called a Viva Fund, and it collapsed. You know, they were supposed to put money together in one box and use it for empowerment projects. But business was going to work together. But apparently, after that, everyone worked for themselves. Yeah. Each company was basically trying to curry favors with whoever politician they can gather in investing for probably future relationships once the ANC was in government. So business had a lot of foresight, which might be classified as bribery.
Mpumi, that's a good point, because I think the moment that we managed the 94 deal, you know, the moment that we had democracy, Bena said, you know, everyone is on their own now. Now we're trying to score deals and influence people as far as we can. We're not going to work together. Whereas before 94, business kind of worked together.
Yeah. And the next question, maybe two. How much time do we still have? Two final questions.
Hi.
Yes. I thought with my brother at the back, and then...
Okay, I can ask it. Okay, I have two questions. My first one deals with the ANC billionaires directly, and actually all billionaires, and what your opinion is when it comes to philanthropy and how that's balanced. And my second question is relating to big business today. What's their responsibility to ensure the country heads in the right direction? You're saying they got involved in the 80s. What's the view now?
What's the role of business now? Okay.
Yeah, good. Mpumi, you should perhaps take the second one. Look, philanthropy is... Patrice Motsepe has given away half his wealth to a family foundation, and they invest a hell of a lot in projects of upliftment, in educational projects, in bursaries and such. So someone like that, I think, understands the importance of plowing money back into the community. Johan Rupert the same, spends about R1 billion of his own money every year on pretty much the same. But they also see that investments in the country. Michiel Roux from Capitec is another guy who spends a hell of a lot of money through his Millennium Fund, supporting Amabungane, supporting Corruption Watch. So a lot of these wealthy billionaires do plow back money into the community. The role of business now, look, I think they need to step up. I think they need to do much more than they are doing. We quickly referenced Thabo Mbeki's many clashes with big business, which there were many in Mpumi. But I do think they need to work much harder to try and put the country back on track. We are in a deep hole. Many of the metrics, like unemployment, like the wealth gap, like the country's national debt, like the budget deficit. Many of these metrics are worse than before 1994, and I think someone like the acting Director General at Treasury, Ishmael Momoniat, is very vocal about we've gone backwards, we've slid backwards into positions worse than 1994. So business needs to step up, and I argued it during the publication of Stellenbosch Mafia. They've got clout, they're sitting on large piles of money,
and they've got contacts.
And they've got contacts, and they should use it. So I think they should put their heads above the parapet much more than they're doing in Mpumi.
All right. Let's have another question here.
Thanks.
Here we go. Here we go.
Thanks for your book, Peter, and thanks, Mpumi. I have a quick question, and that is, I know you don't want to make a judgment, but do you think that your book falls within the framework of elite compacting? Because you're talking about the fact that a lot of help was given. Yes, it was. But the help was given very deliberately to a specific targeted set of people. If you take the RDP and MERG, both of which unfortunately are being wholly mischaracterized, but they were programs which were prepared to give help to a mass of South Africans rather than a limited set
of a coterie of political elites?
Very good question, Fakir.
And Ibrahim's absolutely right. Yes, it falls squarely within the realm of an elite pact. I mean, you don't get much more elite than the Oppenheimers and Anglo, and you don't get much more elite than Oliver Tambo and the ANC's National Executive Committee. And yes, the pact that was struck in 1994 were between the economic and political elites, and many of those structures have remained intact, and we know that. You know, the structure of the economy is not conducive to creating mass-based jobs. You know, the role of the government and the role that the government has played over the last 10 years has not been conducive to the little guy out in the rural areas trying to make a living. So it absolutely falls into the realm of an elite pact. And you're right, that the elite pact is under pressure now, and that's why that's why these questions are being asked, increasingly being asked. The constitutional negotiations, the transition, the economic transition, has that worked for the mass of South Africans? Has democracy worked for the big mass of South Africans, black South Africans, who has been excluded from the economy for decades and decades and decades? And the answer must be no. If you look at unemployment, if you look at the wealth gap, the answer surely is no. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think you're right, and I try to write that in the book because the agreement between big capital and the incoming political class, much of it which was spoken about at Brenthurst, the Oppenheimers estate here in Johannesburg, you know, on the private jet flying back from Lusaka. During meetings between business from the Consultative Business Forum and the Mass Democratic Movement. You know, it tried to preserve the economic structure. Business wanted to preserve their ability to create wealth, and they did. The ANC government should take the blame post-1996 for being unable to change the structure of the economy to benefit the large mass of South Africans that have been excluded.
All right, I want to give the gentleman there and the lady in front of you in quick succession, and then we're going to wrap up.
Okay. Hi, my name is Khotatso. My question is a bit similar to the lady at the back, but with a different angle. Because you're speaking about Anglo and Michael Spies and, you know, all the good English companies, etc. But, like, where do you draw the line between racists, for example? Fine, the Afrikaans apartheid government was, you know, unequivocally racist, but then, you know, your old mutuals and Anglos, etc., who were against apartheid, but were very happy to benefit off cheap labor, building squalor camps, etc. So were they anti-apartheid or were they anti the expansion of their business? I think that's a very important distinction to make.
Yeah.
And then just want to know, are you going to have an audiobook? Because I see South African authors are very, very slow to catch on the audio thing.
We are, and it will be read by Morgan Freeman, which is very cool. Look, Michael Spicer, who was a good guide to me, guiding me through what Anglo's position was, you know, was open about the fact that many people on the Anglo executive back then, you know, were, you know, plain old racists. You know, they were not open to any negotiations with the ANC. They were very happy with exploiting cheap labor, not only from the Eastern Cape, but from Mozambique. You know, this country was built on the mining industry. Johannesburg was built on the mining industry, and that was dependent on the inflow of cheap labor, you know, that was used and spat out very quickly. So they knew they benefited from that for decades and decades. I do think, obviously, there was a lot of opportunism as well. They saw what was coming, and they very quickly saw, like Mpumi said, we need to be on side with the new ruling political class. And the best way to get on side with a new ruling political class, and I'm speaking about business in general here, was to try and influence, co-opt, buy off. That was the game. So yes, there were a lot of racists and individuals, business leaders who did this for the sake of expediency. But I also think, you know, given the complexity of our country's history, that there were good people as well. Good people who saw, look, we've got clout, and we need to start using it with P.W. Botha's government to try and enforce change. So it's not a black and white thing in terms of making blanket assumptions. There were good people, there were bad people, there were people in between. There were people that did it for their own interests, and I think there were people who did it for the national interest. And look, it's one of the biggest achievements of our country was negotiating a transition without a bloody civil war. It's about taking that transition to its logical conclusion, which means creating enough opportunities for everyone, creating an inclusive economy so that we can create jobs, because we're not doing it at the moment. And that's the biggest frustration.
The last question from my sister in front.
Thank you very much. My name is Wendy Nkosi. I'm a researcher from the University of Johannesburg. My questions and a bit of a comment. My first one is I'm here to understand the selective individuals. What's the rationale? Why was it only Thabo Mbeki? Why was it Oliver Tambo selected to form part of those meetings? Number two, I'd like to believe that I don't think it was part of their plan of what's happening today. And I'd like to understand, would you say that it's ANC factionalism has played a huge part in resulting to what's happening today? Because I don't think the Anglos would have appreciated what is happening now with their economy. And the last point I would like to make is, I'm looking forward to reading your book. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good questions. First of all, Thabo Mbeki and Oliver Tambo Oliver Tambo was the president of the ANC back then, and Thabo Mbeki was pretty much Mpumi, the prime minister / minister of foreign affairs. So they were the top of the tree for in the ANC. Yes, ANC factionalism has played an enormously destructive and significant role in our country's recent history. Mpumi and I were both at Polokwane in 2007, and we still go back to Polokwane as one of the most, if not the most significant turning point since 1994, because that's where ANC factionalism also almost became institutionalized, Pumi, almost became, part of the furniture. And they've never recovered from that. So contestation around economic policy, contestation around many other things is built on factionalism, and the dividing lines is also built on those factions. And Pumi, I don't know if you disagree, but it remains destructive and remains the biggest driving force in our politics.
Yeah, I mean, I have my own views. One of my views is that I think that some of the failures of the ANC are conveniently being, blamed on the failures of the transition. So that's why you are having this argument about the ANC sold out, even to the extent that even people like Jacob Zuma, who were themselves part of the transition, part of the negotiations. I mean, Pieter talks about how Mbeki always brought Zuma with him. Each time there was a delegation from South Africa, whether it's business people or other people coming to London, they would meet at Mel's Park, and Zuma would be there. But today you would swear that Zuma was never part of any negotiations with white people. So that's one of the ironies of today when the Radical Economic Transformation grouping speaks. You will swear they were never part of the ANC. Sometimes Zuma comes across as he was a member of the PAC, denouncing constitutional democracy and even talking about land. He supports Black Land First and all of those type of groups.
As if he wasn't president for a decade.
Of course, yeah. So that's why I think books like this are important to always remind us of where we come from. I don't think you can find a perfect book, but certainly a collection of many of this type of work help us with the puzzles. It helps us to solve some of the mysteries about our history. I think Pieter's book is a big contribution to that, and that's why I certainly enjoyed it. And I think those of you who will read it will enjoy it, but it will really make you think, and thinking we should. Thank you, Pieter.
Thanks, Mpumi. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I never do this, but I do want to add something, and that is just to say to your question. Anne Michaels, in her novel Fugitive Pieces, writes that the truth doesn't care what you think about it. And what's important about that is that there is verifiable fact, and then there's our interpretation of the fact. And our duty as publishers and as writers and as authors is to align those facts with a set of interpretations that give us an understanding of our modern contemporary state. That is what history is. It's not absolute. You cannot reach to the truth in absolute terms, but you can always strive to get there. And I think that this book, frankly, is a very, very big contribution towards a better understanding of what that transition was. Thank you. Thank you, Mpumi. That was wonderful. Peter has been told that he's not allowed to leave until all the books are sold and signed. He'll be doing that back there. I also just want to say that Jeremy Gordon, in his absolutely marvelous way, published a review on last week, Thursday or Friday, on Politics Web. And he said he wasn't quite sure. It's a bit like the old debate about behaviorism versus, the environment and, the genetics and whatever with children. Was it the editor? Was it the writer who got it right? Well, I tell you, I have the answer. It absolutely was both of them. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. There's some more wine and food, and enjoy the evening.